This is the year of the great expansion. This year, for the first time, the league will be composed of 12 teams.
A great faith in the future of hockey in general, and more particularly hockey in the United States, and even more specifically in the Twin City area.
And the Rising Stars were raising the roof off the Mid-Sports Center.
Like the Crusaders, the Barons moved to Minnesota and merged with the Minnesota North Stars.
We're going to have one of these in the Twin Cities, and it's going to be ours, and we're going to try and keep it for as long as possible.
Here's Anderson is getting it, he fired, and scores!
The team had to win people back. Everybody understood that, and that's the attitude that we all took.
Didn't think that our team worked hard. To me, that was worse than 4,000 people at a game.
Fuck you, Norm!
Norm sucks! Norm sucks! Norm sucks!
There's no doubt that when you leave a community, you can't be popular, no matter how much you did right. And I really think what's going to happen in Minnesota is that there'll be some introspective thinking. I know we did everything that we possibly could to make it work, and it didn't.
(1965). The Beatles' breathtaking global popularity culminates with their iconic concert at New York's Shea Stadium. The intensifying efforts of the American Civil Rights Movement leads to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and the 6-team NHL makes a gigantic leap towards complete domination over the professional hockey landscape. That year, fueled by their desire to secure a lucrative network television contract in the US and stunt the growth of the Western Hockey League, the NHL announced its most ambitious expansion plan yet. Their intention was to double in size and expand to 12 teams by 1967. Adding 6 new franchises in one fell swoop was, and remains, unprecedented in major pro sports, but given how the original 6 franchises were making money hand over fist, there was no shortage of eager bidders. All told, the NHL entertained bids from 14 different ownership groups from a variety of markets: the Midwest, California, Western Canada, and in the end, the NHL successfully expanded its footprint across the United States, awarding 2 franchises to California, one in LA and another in Oakland, plus one in Pittsburgh, one in Philadelphia, one in St. Louis, and one in Minnesota, the Twin Cities area of Minneapolis-St. Paul to be precise.
And so the world's fastest big league sport, becoming in half a century a multi-million-dollar spectacle, goes on to even greater glory and ever greater crowds. 6 new NHL cities and 6 new teams to ignite the passions of hometown fans.
Frankly though, of all the locales to land an NHL team in the expansion process, none made more sense than Minnesota, a frosty northern state that shares a border with Canada and is unquestionably the mecca of American hockey. They love their hockey in Minnesota, and to this day, Minnesota has produced by far the most NHL players of any US state. It was a perfect fit. And incidentally, the arrival of NHL hockey in the region marked the 3rd big get of the decade for the Twin Cities, further cementing Minnesota as one of America's pro sports strongholds. In 1961, Minnesota landed both an MLB franchise and an NFL team, and now, only a few years later, they had an NHL team too. To decide on a nickname for their new franchise, Minnesota's 8-man ownership group decided to put it to a fan vote. The people of the Twin Cities decided on the North Stars, an homage to Minnesota's state motto, Les Étoiles du Nord. Translation, the Star of the North. And unlike some of their fellow expansion teams like Pittsburgh and St. Louis, these newly minted Minnesota North Stars would have a brand new arena to call home. That was something the NHL insisted on. So, in October of '66, with their inaugural season 12 months away, ground was broken on the 15,000-seat Metropolitan Sports Center, the Met as it came to be known. So, the roster. Look, you already know that expansion drafts generally aren't an effective way to build a competitive roster. And, spoiler alert, that was indeed the case for the North Stars, who were vying with 5 other teams in the '67 expansion draft for, essentially, cast-offs from the original 6 franchises. Not surprisingly, the team they emerged with was hardly a Stanley Cup contender, although Minnesota did manage to land a few unexpected gems in that draft. Players who would go on to become some of the franchise's more memorable names, like Bill Goldsworthy and Cesar Maniego. Plus, while their roster didn't exactly inspire fear throughout the league, the NHL integrated the North Stars and their fellow newcomers graciously. All 6 expansion teams were placed in the same division, which meant they'd be competing against one another for playoff spots, not against the original 6. And so, with the T's crossed and the I's dotted, in the autumn of '67, a new era in NHL history got underway, as did the wonderfully turbulent existence of the Minnesota North Stars. Predictably, amid all the novelty and excitement, the North Stars' first season was bumpy. There were some highlights for sure, like Wayne Connolly's 35-goal outburst and Manniego's impressive play in net, including 6 shutouts. Additionally, among the 6 expansion teams, the North Stars were easily the biggest draw out of the gate, averaging almost 12,000 fans per game in '67-68. However, Minnesota spent virtually the entire campaign chasing a .500 record, and their season is perhaps best remembered for an unthinkable tragedy that occurred midway through. On January 13, 1968, during a game against Oakland at the Met, 29-year-old Bill Masterton, who scored the first goal in North Stars franchise history, took a hard hit that knocked him unconscious, causing him to fall backward. Masterton hit his head on the ice, and this was the era before helmets. He was rushed to a hospital where he was attended to by multiple neurosurgeons, but the severity of the brain injury he had suffered was too great. Just over 24 hours later, Masterton died, marking the first, and of this moment, only on-ice incident in NHL history, resulting in a fatality. Understandably, Masterton's death cast a pall over the North Stars season. And later that year, in fact, the NHL founded an annual award in his honor, the Bill Masterton Memorial Trophy, which is given out to the player who best exemplifies perseverance and sportsmanship. Rather amazingly, however, despite the heavy toll of Masterton's death, the North Stars' tumultuous first season ended with a playoff berth. At 27-32-15, they narrowly beat out the Pittsburgh Penguins for the Western Division's final playoff spot. And they made one heck of a run for the Stanley Cup. In their first ever playoff series, the North Stars outlasted the LA Kings in 7 games, memorably exploding for 9 goals in the decisive Game 7. Then, with a trip to the Stanley Cup on the line, Minnesota forced 7 games again against the St. Louis Blues, ultimately dropping Game 7 in a double overtime heartbreaker. Now theoretically, coming within 1 win of a Stanley Cup berth in their inaugural season could be seen as an auspicious start for the North Stars, a glimpse of the bright future ahead. In reality, however, that season marked the high point of Minnesota's early years. Over the ensuing 3 seasons, the North Stars went a combined 65, 112, and 53, cycling through 4 different head coaches as they tried to find their footing. In each of those 3 seasons, they finished last in the NHL in either goals for or goals against. Hilariously, thanks to the NHL's relatively low barrier to postseason entry at the time, the North Stars actually made the playoffs twice during that span, but they never got farther than they did in '68. And by the time Minnesota managed their first winning season in 71-72 on the backs of Goldsworthy, Jude Drouin, a strong defensive core, and the goaltending tandem of Manniego and future Hall of Famer Gump Worsley, the North Stars had a different problem on their hands. See, in '72, the upstart World Hockey Association, the first league in decades to challenge the NHL for hockey supremacy, began play. And sure enough, one of their original teams was the Minnesota Fighting Saints, whose home rink was about 15 minutes from the Met.
If you believe that the Minnesota Fighting Saints will make it, let's hear it for Glenn Sonmore's team.
Suddenly, the North Stars found themselves competing with another local pro hockey team for the hearts and dollars of hockey fans. And it didn't help that the North Stars became an outright laughingstock during this time. After back-to-back winning seasons in the early 70s, the North Stars devolved into a complete doormat, like even worse than they were during their early years. From 73-74 through 78-79, a span of 6 seasons, Minnesota lost more games than any other team in the NHL and finished either last or second last in their division every year but one. Not surprisingly, fan support dwindled. By 77-78, in fact, even though the Fighting Saints had folded by then, the North Stars were averaging less than 9,000 fans per game, making them the second worst drawing team in the NHL. The North Stars weren't just struggling, they were on the verge of collapsing. However, thanks to the ingenuity of a rival owner whose team was also in dire straits, that didn't happen. Instead, ahead of the 78-79 campaign, the floundering North Stars merged with the only team in the NHL on thinner ice than them, the Cleveland Barons.
Like the Crusaders, the Barons moved to Minnesota and merged with the Minnesota North Stars in 1978, and hockey in Cleveland ended in June of that year.
This kind of maneuver was unprecedented, but the NHL figured it was better to have one team fold than 2. So, in the summer of '78, the Barons owners, Gordon and George Gund, bought out a controlling stake in the North Stars and essentially consolidated their old team with their new one. The merged team would retain the North Stars nickname, history, identity, everything, and a dispersal draft was held to redistribute some of the extra players left over following the merger. It was a funky move to say the least, but it nevertheless ensured that America's hockey capital wouldn't lose its NHL team after little more than a decade. And little did everyone know, it was also a precursor to the most prosperous stretch in franchise history. Between the talent acquired from Cleveland and their years of pitiful performance earning them a bevy of early draft picks, the North Stars turned the corner in a big way in the years following the merger. In 1979-80, the North Stars were a winning team for just the third time in their 13-year history and finished in the top 6 in the NHL in both goals for and goals against. Led by veteran winger Al McAdam and all-star netminder Gilles Meloche, both former Cleveland Barons, plus Bobby Smith and Steve Payne, their first 2 picks in the '78 entry draft, Minnesota made it to the playoffs for just the second time in a 7-year span. And they put up a playoff run for the ages. First, they swept the Maple Leafs in the opening round to secure their first postseason series victory since '71, outscoring Toronto 18-9 over their 3 games. It was in the second round, though, that the North Stars made history, squaring off against the dynastic Montreal Canadiens, who were gunning for a 5th consecutive Stanley Cup title. The North Stars pulled off an unforgettable upset, overcoming a 3-2 series deficit to knock off the Canadiens in an epic 7-game battle. Ultimately, the North Stars Stanley Cup run was thwarted by the Philadelphia Flyers in the following round, but it was clear that this was no longer an organization in disarray. Quite the opposite, in fact. Few teams had more success in the early 1980s than the North Stars. From the start of the decade through 85-86, the North Stars were a playoff fixture, making the postseason 7 years in a row while racking up more points than all but 8 other teams. That stretch was highlighted by their first ever Stanley Cup Finals berth in '81, where they fell in 5 games to the mighty New York Islanders and saw some of the most celebrated players in franchise history come into their own. Not just Smith and Payne, but also Neil Broughton, Brian Bellows, and, of course, Hall of Famer and 7-time 40-goal scorer Dino Ciccarelli. All good things must come to an end, though, and for the North Stars, the good times ended quickly and resoundingly. In fact, after earning their 7th straight postseason berth in 85-86, which saw Broughton set a career high with 105 points, and both Ciccarelli and Scott Bukestad eclipse 40 goals, Minnesota didn't have another winning season. I really can't overstate how abrupt their drop-off was. By 87-88, just 2 seasons removed from a playoff berth, the North Stars were the worst team in the NHL. Incidentally, that miserable season afforded Minnesota the first overall pick in the '88 entry draft, which they used on a kid named Mike Modano, who would go on to become the most accomplished player in franchise history.
Mike, congratulations. Your thoughts? You're obviously very happy to go to Minnesota.
Very excited. You know, it's nerve-wracking. I'm sitting there with my mom. You know, my hands are clammy and sweaty, and it's an honor. You know, I'm glad to be with Minnesota. You know, and I look forward to the season. You know, I'm going to work hard to be a part of the club, and you know, I hope to turn around the club.
That notwithstanding, just like it had during their '70s swoon, the fan support dried up as the losses mounted. In fact, the season after they bottomed out with 19 wins, they had the worst attendance in the league. And with their franchise bleeding money, the Gunn brothers, who had already saved the North Stars once, now had their sights on greener pastures. Amid Minnesota's struggles both on the ice and financially, the Gunns, out of nowhere, began threatening to move the team to the Bay Area, a market that the NHL was eager to tap into again following the failure of the Golden Seals. Only moving the North Stars out west would mean no expansion fee for the NHL and its already existing teams, so the league said no to the Gunns. Eventually, though, a compromise was reached. The Gunns could have their Bay Area expansion franchise, for a hefty fee of course, so long as they agreed to sell the North Stars to a league-approved buyer. So, in the spring of 1990, the Gunns sold the North Stars to Howard Baldwin and Morris Bellsberg, and just over a year later, the San Jose Sharks played their first game. It should be noted that the Sharks roster was filled with former North Stars, a condition of the unique sale and expansion process. Nevertheless, for the second time in their history, Minnesota's NHL team had seemingly been given a new lease on life. Hell, after the sale went through, Baldwin even patted himself on the back for rescuing the North Stars, saying in a statement that he and his partner were pleased to have saved professional hockey for the great fans of this area. Except, well, they weren't the owners very long. See, during the sale process, Baldwin and Bellsberg added a third party to their ownership group on account of some unforeseen financial problems. That man was Norm Green, who was previously one of the co-owners of the Calgary Flames. And apparently, Green didn't want to be a co-owner anymore. Almost immediately, Green bought out a controlling stake in the franchise, and by the time the 1990-1991 season got underway, he was the North Stars' sole owner. It was Green's team that inexplicably made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals in 1991, putting together an unforgettable Cinderella run that belied their losing record in the regular season. Still, as auspiciously as Green's regime began, it quickly became obvious that the North Stars' days in Minnesota were numbered. First, following their unexpected trip to the Cup Finals, the North Stars' logo was curiously redesigned to omit any reference to the word North. Meanwhile, Green's attempts to secure public financing for improvements to the Met fell flat, and he also failed to work out a deal that would move the North Stars to Target Center, the home of the newly formed Minnesota Timberwolves. Throughout it all, he claimed, the North Stars were losing money. The writing was on the wall. And here's the kicker. In 1992, Green was hit with sexual harassment allegations from several of his women employees, one of whom even filed a lawsuit against him. Reportedly, in the wake of those allegations, Green's wife threatened to leave him if he didn't move the team. Well, as it happens, that same year, Green had serious discussions with Anaheim city officials about relocating his team there. Only the league already had a potential Anaheim expansion in the works, a deal that would give Disney an NHL franchise. So, the league kiboshed Green's deal, but as consolation, they'd allow him to move the North Stars to any other city he wanted so long as it didn't infringe on another team's territory. And just like that, the North Stars' fate was sealed. It didn't take long for Green to find a viable, attractive market to move his team to. And in March of '93, Green made it official. The North Stars would be moving to Dallas next season, where they'd become known simply as the Stars. That announcement, that pro hockey was leaving America's de facto Hockeyville, was a major blow for Minnesotans, who spent the final few games of the 92-93 campaign filling the Met with chants of, "Norm sucks."
Norm should have never taken it. Minnesota needs a hockey team.
Minnesota forever. Norm, you suck.
Norm sucks! Norm sucks! Norm sucks! Norm sucks!
Norm, you suck, man. Why are you leaving the team for Minnesota? It's the birthplace of hockey.
Norm, as a season ticket holder, I'm very upset that you're leaving us, and I hope that you have nothing but bad success in Dallas.
To this day, Norm Greed remains a pariah in the Twin Cities. However, as gutting as it was to see their team up and leave for Texas and even become Stanley Cup champions just a few years later, the story of NHL hockey in Minnesota does have a happy ending. In 1997, as part of their turn-of-the-century expansion blitz, the league announced that NHL hockey would be returning to the Twin Cities. 3 years later, the Minnesota Wild played their first game, ending the region's NHL hockey hiatus after 8 years.
As we begin this new era, we wanted you to know something. In our world, the fans will always be number one. And to demonstrate that commitment, tonight, we will retire our first sweater in honor of you. No Wild player will ever wear the #1 sweater. Minnesota Wild fans, you are #1.
And nearly a quarter century later, the Wild are still going strong, but the legacy of the North Stars lives on in Minnesota. Even though their history technically belongs to Dallas, the Twin Cities will never forget the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of the North Stars, the original NHL franchise in America's hockey heartland.